I'm grateful for all the people who keep circulating those lists of church bulletin bloopers around the internet on email. I'm grateful to them because though I've read them dozens of times, they still make me laugh every time someone sends them to me. I'm sure you've heard them as well. The sermon this morning, Jesus walks on water. The sermon this evening, searching for Jesus. Ladies, don't forget the rummage sale. It's a chance to get rid of those things not worth keeping around the house. Bring your husbands. Sorry about the sexism. Irving Benson and Jessie Carter were married on October 24th. So ends a friendship that began in their school days. Those bulletin bloopers make us chuckle because they play on the double meanings of words. Words can and do have multiple meanings, and the meaning that we hear often depends on the context in which we hear them. The same is true of stories. Stories can and do have more than one meaning, depending on the context in which we hear them. And so stories get reinterpreted continually as they are retold in different contexts. That is their beauty, and that is their power. A power that can be used to heal and to encourage, but also a power that can be used to hurt and abuse. And using stories in that latter way is no laughing matter. The ancient story of Abraham and Sarah is one that has been told and retold throughout history and reinterpreted in many different contexts. We find that story actually retold in our own Bible itself, retold in ways that shift its meaning. As we heard together this morning, the Genesis storyteller shares this story as a very, very human one. Abraham is portrayed as a very imperfect guy who struggles mightily to trust the promises of God for his life, even to the point of laughing at God when God promises to bring him and Sarah children in their very old age. Ancestors that will become the heart of God's people. But centuries later, when the Apostle Paul retells this story, he portrays Abraham, if you noticed in the New Testament reading, as a paragon of virtue. Abraham, he says, never doubted, never wavered for a minute. And as a reward for that, God fulfilled God's promise to Abraham and Sarah, and they produced a lineage that gave us Jesus. So, which interpretation of Abraham is correct? Was he certain of God's guidance from the very start? Or was he a doubter and a struggler who nevertheless kept journeying and journeying with God to see how it would all turn out? Well, maybe that's the wrong question to bring to a story to begin with. Because a story can have more than one meaning. A story can help us to see what we need to see and speak to us in ways that we need to be spoken to in different ways at different times. Personally, I like the Genesis portrait of Abraham because I am constantly asking questions and struggling with my own faith, and I certainly hope that God is as patient with me as God was with Abraham and Sarah on their journeys. The Genesis story reminds me that indeed God is patient and understanding of my human limitations as I make my way through this world with God. So, how we tell and retell the story can make a great deal of difference in how we go forward with our lives. And which parts we embellish and which parts we leave out altogether when we retell a story can shape the way that we see the world. For instance, in Christian lectionaries, which prescribe the passages that we read each Sunday of the church year, we do not ever get the chance to hear the part of the story that tells us that Abraham already had a son before Isaac was born. That comes in the chapter before. So, as was often the custom, or rather the Genesis storyteller, according to the Genesis storyteller, Abraham's wife, Sarah, as we did read this morning, was unable to bear children. So, as was often the custom of that time, Sarah offered Hagar, her Egyptian slave, as a concubine for Abraham. And Hagar becomes pregnant. And thus begins a painful rivalry between Hagar and the now jealous Sarah. And to make a long story a bit shorter, Sarah makes Hagar's life miserable so that she runs to the desert to escape. And while in the desert, God sends an angel to comfort Hagar and to tell her that God will bring from her child a great nation, through whom God's blessings will come to all the world. Hagar returns to Abraham and has a son, and names him Ishmael, which means God hears. Soon after this, according to the Genesis storyteller, God promises an heir to Abraham through Sarah, an heir who will become a great nation, through whom God's blessings will come to all the world. And Sarah bears a son and names him Isaac, meaning laughter, because she and Abraham had laughed in disbelief when God promised them a son in old age, and perhaps even because this child's birth made them laugh with joy. The story is a fascinating story, with even more twists and turns that would make this sermon far, far too long. But my point in telling it is that as Christians, who also depend on our Jewish roots for grounding, we only hear one side of this story in our worship. We rejoice with Sarah that she finally has a son by the miraculous intervention of God, a son whose lineage would bring us Jesus. But we do not concern ourselves with Ishmael. But there are others who do. In the Islamic tradition, the lineage of Ishmael brings them Muhammad, who receives the Quran as a divine revelation. So, the two largest religions in the world, in terms of the numbers of their followers, trace their roots back to this very same story. And obviously, the Jewish tradition does as well. And that's why these three great monotheistic traditions are called the Abrahamic faiths. But though we share a common story, we emphasize different parts of the story. And we often interpret this story in different ways. And the truth of the matter is that within each of these three great religious traditions, we interpret this story in vastly different ways. And this has significant consequences, because how you interpret a story is no laughing matter. The Reverend Mike Huckabee, a Southern Baptist pastor, referred to this story this past fall during an event called Star-Spangled Sunday, in which he focused on the rivalry between the two children of Abraham and Sarah. He said, and I quote, "I got news for all the dispirited and disquieted Christians in America who are somehow afraid that the sons of Ishmael, who are challenging us now in the Middle East, will overwhelm the sons of Isaac. Let me assure you, I have read the end of the book. My dear friends, we win, and our flag still stands." It seems to me that to use this story to perpetuate a rivalry that pits one religion against another is to put oneself dangerously close to using the very same rhetoric that terrorist groups are using all around the world. Rhetoric that uses religion as a tool to stir up fear and hatred and a desire to dominate others. It seems to me, at least, that ISIL is a heinous terrorist group that is perverting the beauty of the Islamic faith into a tool to be used to spew fear and hate and domination. Just as it seems to me that the Ku Klux Klan, which though weakened still exists, is a heinous terrorist group also that perverts the beauty of the Christian faith into a tool to be used to spew fear and hate and domination. And when someone tells me a religious story that justifies hate and ill will toward another human being or another group of human beings, then I go looking for another interpretation. And that is the grave, grave danger of fundamentalism. Whether it is Islamic fundamentalism or Jewish fundamentalism or Christian fundamentalism. The danger of all fundamentalism is that it tells stories as if they have only one meaning. It tells stories as if they have only one meaning. And that, my friends, is a dangerous misconception. And that is a dangerous misconception that is no laughing matter. And a misconception that threatens humanity's very future. So, here's another interpretation of this shared story. A hopeful and life-giving interpretation that I ran across in a 2011 blog by Lucy Chumley, who's editor of an Episcopal newspaper called Washington Window. And this is what she wrote to close her earlier blog. When the patriarch Abraham died at a ripe old age and was gathered to his people, his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, came together to bury him, as is recorded in Genesis chapter 25. Death has a way of bringing families together, exposing our shared and sometimes complicated roots. Though their lives were set on an adversarial course, Isaac and Ishmael were brothers. Isaac and Ishmael were brothers. On the 10th anniversary of 9/11, we do well to remember that. And I'd suggest that we would do well to remember that always. Because how we tell and retell stories is no laughing matter. But if we tell our stories in ways that are intended to bring healing and love to the world, we may actually hear the faint sound of God laughing. Not laughing at us, but laughing with us. Laughing like Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, because we have finally gotten it. We have finally gotten it that Isaac and Ishmael were kin, and that we are too. All of us. Amen.